My friends, Ukraine is retreating from the Robotine salient. We're witnessing the nightmare scenario. The Russian army is now pressing the salient from all directions, and they're quickly rolling back all the gains Ukraine has achieved in the past months.
It is far from a failure.
Indeed, difficult decisions lie ahead for Ukraine. Ukraine has captured this area at the cost of thousands of NATO-trained soldiers, over 200 armored vehicles, and now they're just giving it all up. All these sacrifices, for what? As you can imagine, the situation on the Zaporozhye front is critical. Put simply, Robotine is in a fire bag, and the Ukrainian command is struggling to supply all its troops in the sector. Check out this article from the New York Times. Russia retakes some land hard won by Ukraine during counteroffensive. And we all remember what I told you a couple weeks ago. They have been deployed there to launch a counterattack, either to retake lost positions like Robotine or worse, because it opens them to a flanking maneuver. Potentially, the Ukrainians would have to abandon all their latest gains. This was the front on September 1st, 3 months into this Ukrainian counteroffensive. On the 23rd of September, Ukrainian General Tarnavsky told Ukrinform, the biggest breakthrough in the counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine is yet to come. British-made tanks are about to sweep Putin's conscripts aside. From these positions, Ukraine managed to push some more until they reached their furthest expansion pack on December 4th, when the Russians launched their own counteroffensive in the sector, or according to the Western media, we should say the counteroffensive. And like you can see on this map from Web-Union, the Russians started rolling back all of Ukraine's gains from the summer and reconquering all the ground they have lost. Interestingly, this happened shortly after the elite 47th and 116th Mechanized Brigades were transferred out from Robotine to deal with the worsening situation in Avdiivka. That would mean that the Russian High Command planned well-coordinated operations on multiple fronts. Russian generals gave an offer the Ukrainians couldn't refuse, with major offensives in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, as well as around Kupiansk, forced Ukraine to redeploy elite units to these critical sectors, and then allowed the Russians to launch a counteroffensive on the Zaporozhye front. This is pure World War II Soviet operational doctrine. Even worse, this is exactly what happened at the Battle of Kursk, if only somebody had talked about it. At this point, we can call the Ukrainian Spring-Summer Offensive Operation Citadel. There are way too many similar things. The main Ukrainian units defending the Robotine salient are the 117th and 118th Mechanized Brigades, the 33rd and 65th Mechanized Brigades, the 82nd Air Assault Brigades, all of them supported by ideologically motivated units of the Chervona Kalina, Spartan, and Karadag brigades. I only have some sparse information about these units. For example, Chervona Kalina lost almost an entire company during a firefight in late November, so I doubt all these units are at full strength. But the most important task will be for the 118th and 65th Mechanized Brigades to hold the flanks, in order to allow the other brigades to retreat in good order to better positions. Anyway, enough with the spoilers. The Russian command picked up on the withdrawal of the 47th and 116th Mechanized Brigades and immediately seized the window of opportunity. They knew that the big dilemma for Ukraine was how to hold all the ground they had painfully gained during the summer offensive, and more specifically, how to continuously supply all the troops positioned in and around the salient. There's only one paved road going from Novodanilivka to Robotine, and there's another smaller road going from Robotine to Verbove. But all those regularly get shelled by the Russians. Using these roads is a high-risk, low-reward situation. More often than not, Ukrainians have to use dirt roads that get filled with mud the moment it rains. In this video, you can see one of the muddy roads used by Ukrainian logistics leading towards Robotine.
Найпотужніша автівка нині може подолати лише лічені кілометри асфальтом. Близько години у суцільній темряві під дощем повз нерухомі бронемашини ущент розбитою ґрунтовкою. Доправити військових та підвести боєкомплект чи продукти ближче до лінії фронту наразі здатна лише броньована техніка на гусянці.
Then Ukraine also needs to evacuate the wounded and organize rotations to send replacements forward. All this for them to pick a spot in one of the ruins of Robotine. At least we know Ukrainian soldiers only suffer from a lack of artillery ammunition. The Russian counteroffensive started with a massive artillery preparation on Ukrainian positions. A lot of attention was put on Robotine itself and the area west of the village of Verpove. We're talking about 150mm Yatsint B howitzers, then 122mm double Ds, D30s. In this footage from November 30th, you can see how they landed 24 shells on this one tree line alone. That same day, they also targeted this Ukrainian fire team as they were rotating out from the front. And such events happen day and night, whether done on foot or in vehicles. This is carried by the work of drone operators who make sure to target any vehicle or unit that could be used to transport supplies. That's how another Leopard 2A4 was hit on the southern part of the village of Robotine. On December 1st, the Ukrainian command needed a quick PR stunt, so they gathered some Kampfgruppe, a task force, and came up with an unpredictable plan. Rush Novoprokopivka.
Oh shit, here we go again.
As you can see in this footage, the assault was led by a column of 3 BMPs supported by some infantry. The attack was costly because all 3 BMPs were destroyed and left behind. It's highly unlikely that these will be able to be retrieved and brought back to the rear for repair. Meanwhile, the supporting infantry came under heavy fire from Russian artillery and was then forced to pull back. Shortly after, the Russians counterattacked and cancelled the latest Ukrainian advance. It's paratroopers of the 76th Airborne Division that led the push and mopped up all the positions previously manned by the Ukrainians. This is when they probably captured these 2 Ukrainian soldiers. Here you can see a first-person perspective of what I think is the same event. Now, according to these Russian soldiers, most of the Ukrainian POWs these days are all mobilized personnel. Barely anyone is a professional soldier or volunteer from the early days of the war. On the 4th of December, the Russians managed to advance 500 meters on a 3-kilometer front west of Robotine. We know this because they posted this picture where they posed next to an abandoned Leopard 2A4 geolocated right here on the map. What happened is that a couple days before their attack, they managed to destroy yet another Leopard 2A4 using 2 ATGMs and 2 FPV drone strikes. They were probably using the double tap perk. On a side note, it seems the Leopards defending Robotine are now part of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, the original unit they were supposed to be assigned to before the counteroffensive. It took the Russians 3 days and a lot of artillery bombardments to fully secure the area. 4 days later, the Ukrainians launched an armored counterattack to regain their lost positions, but it was met by a storm of steel. As always, the problem is minefields. Here's what a Ukrainian sergeant from a unit of sappers had to say.
Проходить під штурмові групи. Тобто мої сапери працюють далі, ніж працюють штурмовики. Вблизі із противником десь 50-40 метрів мої сапери заходять.
Of course, the reason why Ukrainian sappers have to open path by foot is because they lack demining vehicles. And whenever they do use them, since there's so few, they can easily get targeted by the enemy.
Ще проблема – це і FPV-дрони. Мої сапери не можуть дійти до роботи. Не можуть доїхати. Останній раз виїзд на Хаммері був плачебний 4300 у мене сапера, хороших робочих сапера, на родних сапери, які отработали 5 місяців, і FPV-дрони не дають працювати. Тобто Хаммер виїхав, 2 FPV-дрона попало в Хаммер протягом 5 кілометрів. Проблема така. Проблема, як завжди, нагальна – це транспорт, розход. Це розходний матеріал, тобто машини. Доїхати до роботи, то машини треба.
That's something I heard all across the board for Ukrainian brigades. Ukrainian troops constantly organize fundraisers just to buy a couple more Toyota pickup trucks. Although it's true they can get stuck, these pickups are still the fastest and cheapest way to bring supplies to the contact line for medevac operations and quick rotations of military personnel. Now back to the map. It seems the goal of the Russian attack was to capture this set of trenches they had built before the summer, which they could then use as a stepping stone to devastate the rear of the Ukrainian defenders of Robotine. Similarly, they were also eyeing the sector south of Robotine, where there was also a major fortified bastion. So the plan was to penetrate enemy lines both from the front and back doors. Before the assault, they tried to soften Ukrainian positions, not only with artillery, but with swarms of drones, like this one targeting an ATGM crew guarding the southern road. And interestingly, because of the reduction of Western ammunition supplies, especially in artillery, Ukraine is considering to compensate for this loss by bringing thousands of nationally produced kamikaze drones to the front. On the 10th of December, Russian assault units stormed this entire sector, pushing 1.5 kilometers deep and almost 2 kilometers wide. At this point, the Russians were only 500 meters away from the settlement of Robotine. These 4 scouts of the 1430th Motorized Rifle Regiment were awarded medals by their regiment commander for their successful assault of the previous day.
Ці вщент викошені і розтрощені посадки, південніша робота над вікном Прокопівки нині і тривають найзапекліші піхотні протистояння.
It became clear to the Ukrainian headquarters that the Russians were launching a serious offensive. Reinforcements had to be sent to the front at all costs. Small infantry squads were sent forward by foot because of all the mud. Meanwhile, this unit is walking at night under heavy enemy shelling. They probably thought they were walking straight into hellfire. Sadly, not all Ukrainian reinforcements made it, especially the ones transported in armored vehicles. Many columns never even made it close to the village. Mind you, some of these guys were conscripts that spent a couple weeks in training, and they get KA before even reaching the front. As you can see in this video from the Ukrainian perspective, their one and only paved supply road is filled with burnt vehicles surrounded by a shattered lunar landscape. And because of winter, there's barely any cover now. In this video from the Robotine sector, you see an FPV drone attack on a Leopard 2A6, and notice the Bradleys right beside it. Talking about that, in this video you can see a junkyard of M2A2 Bradleys of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. Apparently those are only the ones destroyed in June, but in my opinion those could very well be IFVs that were cannibalized for spare parts to compensate for the lack of maintenance at the front. By the 16th of December, the situation was getting critical. Every sector of the front was under heavy pressure, and it became clear that the Zaporozhye front would not receive any additional reinforcements. Blyat, who's going to tell them? Meanwhile, the Russians were regrouping an armored fist in this sector, most likely to cut off the supply road. But this was avoided by drone operators of the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which spotted this assembly point and destroyed 2 Russian tanks west of Robotine. The next day, same thing, but it's a Ukrainian armored unit that was intercepted as it exited Robotine on its way to Novoprokopivka. 1 Humvee, 2 FVs, and this tank were destroyed and abandoned. Imagine the effect on morale for these Ukrainian crews that would literally have to cross this no man's land filled with friendly burnt vehicles all over the place. On the 22nd of December, after consolidating the lines west of Robotine and repelling Ukrainian counterattacks against Novoprokopivka, the Russians concentrated assault squads in this area south of the Sorovikin line. And let's say they went balls to the wall. Either the Ukrainians were in the middle of a withdrawal, or there was a rotation and the unit that was meant to replace the guys at the front never made it. In any case, the Russians pushed deep into that direction. Here you can see a Russian fire team mopping up a tree line, whereas in this video some Ukrainian soldiers are seen retreating from the battlefield. This video was geolocated right here at the start of the Dragon Teeth line, a position that had cost them so many men to capture. The Russians did admit that this assault was not without losses, and many complained that a good number of these airborne assault units were filled up with replacements with little to no combat experience. However, in the right circumstances and under the right leadership, even green units can achieve significant success, especially when they're supported by actual veterans. This is where I have to talk about 35-year-old Sergei Stashnev from St. Petersburg, call sign Panda, part of the 15th Company 234th Airborne Regiment. He was mobilized in October 2022. Apparently he didn't mind and almost volunteered because he didn't want young guys to die at the front. He was pretty confident because he was a veteran and had 8 years of training with the Spetsnaz, and even got combat experience in Syria. That's when he was KIA on a combat mission near Robotine at the end of November, leaving behind his wife and daughter. Thoughts and prayers for his family. Of course, that's just a glimpse of the Russian losses in this sector. Russian assault units were conducting offensive operations, capturing one stronghold after another, all over this Robotine cauldron. Regardless, the maneuver was clearly an encirclement of Robotine. Before launching the general assault, on Christmas Day, Russian Uragan MR-less systems bombarded this settlement over and over, along with his best friend Zaltipyok. Or perhaps the Russians had something else in mind, because the day before they heavily shelled Ukrainian positions 3 kilometers west of Verbove. Perhaps the attack on Robotine was a diversion and the real attack would be a flanking maneuver from the east. Another major problem for Ukraine from what I've seen. Just like south of Bakhmut, a lot of Ukrainian troops are holding isolated dugouts that can hardly support each other in case of an enemy attack. How do you expect Ukrainian soldiers to hold the line when most of their trenches look like that? At this point, Russian Telegram reports mentioned that the 117th and 118th Mechanized Brigades were withdrawing 300 to 500 meters from their positions, cancelling out half the gains they had made in the past months. During their push forward, Russian soldiers passed this Polish-made PT-91 Twarde, half drowned in the muddy pond. According to this post from Military Land, this tank most likely belonged to the 117th Mechanized Brigade. Those claims were confirmed as Russian troops were spotted 3 kilometers from the Surovikin line. We don't have much information, but as you can see here, a firefight caused the destruction of a German-made Mada IFV and 2 other Ukrainian armored vehicles. However, what followed next? We see a Russian fire team of 4 soldiers that captured 3 Ukrainian soldiers, most likely from the 117th Mechanized Brigade. These guys had openly surrendered to them. The Russians lined them up, and yeah, they showed them no mercy. This is messed up, but not only that, it's the second time that this happens, caught on camera. Oh yeah, and a couple days earlier, the Russians had captured 2 other Ukrainian soldiers, but for some reason the Russians momentarily used them as shields. According to the images, it was to force the rest of the Ukrainian squad to lay down their weapons and surrender. I mean, this is very possible to happen when you have former inmates as stormtroopers. If we consider this position now under Russian control, the most rational move for Ukraine would be to withdraw and straighten its front line. If this is not promptly done, Russian assault units could push another 2 kilometers northwards along this same tree line and squeeze out the Ukrainians from the sector west of Verbove. And the problem is, if you look at a topographic map, the Russians now hold almost the entire high ground, and this would force the Ukrainians to withdraw in the lowland, fully exposed to enemy fire. That's why as early as December 27th, there were growing reports that the Ukrainians were in the process of fully withdrawing from their positions south of the Surovikin line, and thus avoid being encircled. So that's one scenario, but there's another course of action the Russians could do that could be even more lethal. It's a bit more complicated to pull off on a tactical level, but they could zigzag from one tree line to another for 3 kilometers westwards and flank Robotine from the east, as well as from the west and the south, leaving only one exit. Unless some massive reinforcements arrive and manage to counterattack at least one of these attacks, the Ukrainians will have no other choice but to abandon Robotine. In this case, the Ukrainians will most likely have to withdraw to the second line of defense and abandon the bulk of the salient. But if the Russians manage to tell the Ukrainians, and if they have enough reserves, not only could they reconquer all the lost ground, but they could also aim for an attack on Orikhiv. In this nightmare scenario, the Ukrainians will have to withdraw all the way behind the Konka River, and that would bring the enemy right in front of the gates of Zaporozhye.